So I was just thanking all the panelists for finishing on time. Before I throw it open to the floor, I was going to use my chair's prerogative to just ask a couple of questions of the other panelists. Starting with Kevin, with you, you mentioned that for these antimicrobials, both price and volume are a problem. And I wonder if you could give us a sense of which of those is more important, and particularly, obviously the orphan drugs also have very low volume, but they manage to command very high prices, and so 40% of the new drugs coming through the FDA are orphan drugs. So low volume in itself is not a problem. It seems to me that it really is the pricing that is different for these. And I'm wondering if it's because they're mostly inpatient drugs covered by DRGs, or whether there's something else about them that makes these an unattractive small class.
So thank you for that question. There's a couple of answers to that. One is the one you just identified. You know, most of these hospital-based antibiotics are intravenous and they're Medicare Part A. And being included in the bundle is a uniquely powerful detriment to this class. A bill was introduced in Congress yesterday in the House called Disarm Act. A previous version is also in the Senate, which tries to address that. Also in the Medicare inpatient prospective payment rule due out on August 2nd, it's indicated in the interim rule that there'll be something that Medicare may well do in this area. Second answer is that I think everybody in the field, the stakeholders, the public health people, and the companies, they're all don't want the $1 million antibiotic because they fear what that will do to marketing and therefore destroying stewardship. So nobody actually wants, including the industry, an orphan drug-priced antibiotic because of how it would blow up marketing. Third answer is that our diagnostics are still terrible. And so when you talk to ID doctors, the patient coming in who's febrile and unconscious and you have to treat them within an hour or else you've committed malpractice, they treat them empirically, which is code word for we don't know what they have in terms of bacteria, so we're going to treat them with something broad spectrum. And later, after 3 days when the diagnostics come back, then they may move them on to one of the newer, more specific drugs. And so the diagnostic uncertainty prevents utilization of the actual right drug for the right patient in the first hour. And that's part of the reason why Carbex also spends 20% of our portfolio, 10 to 20% on diagnostics, because this is a related problem that compounds our issues here.
Okay, thank you for that. And Doug, if I just may ask you a question too. You provided some very compelling evidence of the power of pharmaceuticals, the cost effectiveness of pharmaceuticals in bringing down total costs if they're appropriately used. I think all the examples you gave were for infectious diseases and drugs to treat infectious diseases. Are there any examples on, can you speak to the use and how you find the use of drugs affecting total costs for some of the chronic medications that are not for infectious diseases?
Yeah. It's a good question. So that's the next frontier, I think, for us. So diabetes, hypertension is sort of the next frontier, if you will, because of the high rates of comorbidities in those areas. And we just don't have the data at the present time. And the highest cost, the highest portions of total cost of care are really that facility-based care connected to those infectious diseases. And so that's where we've been able to focus and make inroads. But I think what you bring up is actually the next frontier for a plan like ours.
Okay, so it's that you don't have the evidence, not that it goes one way or the other.
Correct.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, I will stop hogging the floor here. First question, if you could speak into the microphone and introduce yourself when you speak. Thank you.
Now, okay. Thank you, Dr. Danzon, for moderating this panel. And I'm Ross Henderson, CEO of Carum, Geospatial Epidemiology Company. And this question is for Mr. Otterson. and it's for the webinar participants. I'll read it. So you're in BU, which is a super town in a progressive state. What is your informed, intelligent opinion of the future of medical marijuana, especially edibles? For instance, in Virginia, where I live, medical marijuana has been legislated unanimously, but not regulated, and signed as an emergency bill overnight by the governor in February 2018. Yet circuit judges are obliged to levy penalties. Now in Canada, recreational cannabis has been legalized, yet not everyone is kicking it. Is this normal? You know, National Organization of Reform Marijuana Laws is where? So this is a judicial and medical question. Thank you.
So I'm pretty sure that's beyond the scope of today's workshop.
Well,
but I will say that my colleague at Boston University, Professor Jay Wexler, actually teaches a class and researches in this issue. You know, I do not.
Look. Naturopathy, there's 6 approved ND degrees in the U.S. and Canada, right? And NDs are the future. So this is an affordable drug. And by the way, I worked at NIAD, and allergies are an orphan stepchild. So I would like this is affordable. And we're in D.C., right? Medical marijuana is everywhere. And in Maryland, it's there. And this is a very calming, pejorative drug. It's a drug and it's cheap.
I think if I may just intervene here, I think nobody's disagreeing that it is potentially an affordable drug. It's just not the focus of this panel, which is on innovation and paying for innovative drugs. And so I'd like to turn to the next question. Thanks, Bhavin.
Okay. Great, thanks. So thank you for the excellent panel. I want to ask a question. I'll direct it to Professor Danzon, but I think maybe the panel can speak to it as well. So you laid out a specific proposal, or maybe tentatively, the idea that one incorporate some sort of cost-effectiveness threshold for NIH-funded drugs. I have some questions, reflecting my ignorance of it, about just whether cost-effectiveness methodology is kind of ready for prime time in a way, but put those aside for a moment. One question is, would using these cost-effectiveness thresholds actually solve all of the affordability problems that Lee Purvis and others talked about? So I'm thinking of drugs like Sovaldi and others, which are both cost-effective but also perhaps unaffordable. And I wonder if anyone on the panel could comment on that. And then second, and this might be less for the panel, but for maybe Ashley Stevens in the tech transfer community or pharma representatives of pharmaceutical companies in the audience, like, could the system tolerate a proposal? Would the technology transfer system still work without imploding upon itself, like we talked about it may with margin rights, with a proposal like Professor Danzon's, where if you license an NIH-funded drug, you have to agree to fairly generous cost-effectiveness thresholds.
So if I may respond first, and then I'll turn it over to the other panelists. The proposal to use a cost-effectiveness threshold is a possible way of dealing with getting some sort of rate of return on NIH funding that is much less of a all-or-nothing approach compared to march-in rights. With march-in rights, either the company has everything or it is virtually all taken away. With the cost-effectiveness approach, the company still gets to keep the product. It is simply that there is a ceiling, and that ceiling could be set wherever society wants to set that ceiling. It could be set quite high, but there is a ceiling on what can be charged per unit of health gain that has been delivered. So it's a ceiling on the price per unit of health gain, not an absolute ceiling on any price. The more effective the drug, the higher the price could be. Is the system ready? Is cost effectiveness ready for prime time? I ask you relative to what? There is no decent alternative. There is certainly no better alternative. The status quo is severely broken. I spoke to that. I think Lee spoke very persuasively to that. And for sure, we need more work on exactly how it would be implemented using different cost-effectiveness thresholds for different types of drugs, possibly for different health plans. It doesn't have to be one size fits all. There could be negotiations off of that with rebates, etc., just as under the present system. This would simply put a limit on the list price that could be charged. So that would be my response, that there is a sort of pathological aversion to this approach in the US, whereas I think it is much more benign for both R&D incentives and for getting appropriate prices compared to alternatives like pegging our prices to foreign prices, which you saw from my slide would cut US prices roughly by 2/3. I mean, that to me is a non-starter. And it would distort pricing in this country and in other countries. So it's really a question of relative to what. There are no silver bullets here. And I think if we work on that, that has a lot of efficiencies and good things going for it.
So I think the NICE system in England has been ready for prime time for many years. And in my narrow world of antibiotics, the industry has very thoughtfully engaged with NICE for the past 2 years to address the need to pay more for antibiotics. So NICE has typically been trying to reduce the price. This is one area in which they're trying to appropriately price the positive externalities of antibiotic therapy and to pay more. And the health minister from the United Kingdom announced now 2 weeks ago that they'll pilot this new methodology, which people are sometimes calling the subscription or the Netflix model, that United Kingdom will pay a fixed amount per year for access to an antibiotic, whether they use it a little or a lot. And the hope is to use it almost none, right? But that work is based on economists at the University of York who worked for 2 years to price out the positive externalities with strong endorsement and engagement by industry. So when industry engages in this process with governments or with ICER in the United States, I think this process could be very positive and useful.
Just coming from a consumer perspective, I think you've already heard some allusion to this already on the panel, but cost effectiveness is definitely a challenging topic when it comes to kind of having that discussion with the American public. That said, I think there's definitely a growing recognition that whether it's cost effectiveness or comparative effectiveness or a mixture of a lot of different other factors, the reality is there does need to be some kind of level set in terms of pricing and whether those prices are justified, because we don't want to go about trying to implement change on a broken system, and I think that is going to be part of the discussion.
Professor Danzon, I think Barvin was asking me to comment on including this in the license in the tech transfer system. It's not clear that it's possible. Using a license agreement to control prices is a de facto antitrust violation. However, it's not clear whether it would be an antitrust violation if the mechanism was intended to lower prices. It's definitely an antitrust violation if you're using a license agreement to maintain high prices. When we were looking at socially responsible licensing, this issue came up and it remained unresolved in when we were looking at those issues back in the mid to late 2000s. So I don't know if it would work or not. Have you tried amending antitrust law? again, it comes down to, the reasonable pricing clause, and do you deter the development? And, I don't know, but the Hippocratic oath of license of academic tech transfer is first do no harm.
Yeah, I think depending on if this were implemented, I'm not sure it necessarily would be part of a specific licensing agreement between an academic institution and a company. It could be just part of the general knowledge about how reimbursement is going to be set. And because most of the actual nitty-gritty negotiation will be between the ultimate payer and the company that developed it. So I feel confident that is one of the lesser objections to this approach. Thank you. The next question, please, and if you would give your background.
Oh, sure. My name is Stephanie Guerra. I'm going to be a science policy fellow at the VA this fall. My background's in cancer biology, but my question's actually for Kevin. I learned a lot from your talk because I don't know as much about antibiotics. In your response to the first question of this period, you kind of give some compelling reasons why antibiotics won't garner high prices. But given the importance of the problem of combating superbugs, are there other ways to drive innovation in private industry for this problem, or will it be up to nonprofits like yours to lead the way?
Thank you.
So I don't think this is a problem, that is a problem that CARB-X can solve, because even if we made the cost of R&D zero, I showed on that one slide that all the companies that are still losing money, even if their R&D costs have been zero. So we have to do something on the pull incentive, the post-marketing approval side. One way is to increase prices. Another way is to increase volumes. Both of those are difficult or dangerous for antibiotics. The received consensus opinion now, which a decade ago, Aaron and I wrote an article that was considered maybe a little fringe at the time, and now it's really the received wisdom. You need to separate the value of what the market pays for antibiotics from the volume. And you can call this delinkage, or you can call it the Netflix subscription model. We're talking about the same thing. Not paying for antibiotics based on volume, but paying based on the value to society or access to society. That is the basis of the United Kingdom pilot project announced 2 weeks ago, I guess, now. And it's also the basis of legislative attempts in the United States that we'll see in the next few months. But it's a radically different way for paying for the drugs, right? But it's the same way that we pay for the fire protection in this room, we don't pay the company that made the fire protection equipment in the ceiling only when there's a fire at the National Academies of Sciences, right? You pay for the equipment as protection, and making that mental leap from we're paying for use versus paying for protection or access is what's happened with the antibacterial field.
Just to follow up on that, Kevin, in the UK it's relatively easy to do because the NHS is a single payer. How would you envisage this working in the US? Would it be the individual hospitals that would pay for access, or would it be individual health plans?
Because our system of payers is so complex, this is a great question. I would, if I was the antibiotic company, I would hate to have to negotiate separately with the 4,000 hospitals and thousands of other institutions, or even the multiple hundreds of payers in the United States. Kill me now, right? So the solution, even in a situation like the U.S. in which we don't have a national health system, would need to be some sort of a government payment. You can call it an antibiotic prize. You can call it an antibiotic market entry reward. In fact, 14 Democratic senators, introduced an antibiotic market entry reward bill in this session a couple of weeks ago, and this idea would be paid out of an agency, out of HHS, and the company would still be allowed to sell the drug, but under increasingly even stricter rules on marketing and stewardship and whatnot. So the company would have very low sales, but at least would walk away with with a significant dollar amount to both recoup R&D and also to help them do the post-approval sort of studies and additional clinical work that's needed.
Thank you. Yeah, Ami.
Hi. Yeah, I've got two quick ones. One for Doug. I'm just curious about to what degree this net model discussed in New York and has it resonated there and is it moving forward in terms of some of these infectious disease drugs in particular. For exceptionalism of antibiotics, I'm just curious, what elements of the CARB-X program do you think can apply outside of the antibiotic space? And also within even the antibiotic space, can you comment on how much more difficult your operation would be if you would impose more conditions on your licensing?
As far as I'm aware, in New York, primarily paying for the costs, wide-scale access to these infectious disease specialty drugs has really been trade-offs between the state and manufacturers around lower price, higher rebates for higher volume. And I think that what I have urged is where there are opportunities like a hepatitis C drug that's a cure, is that the conversation either shift to or include this concept of a cost of a cure, where the dollars are spread out over a period of time, where you would see the other reductions in medical costs as a way to ensure affordability from a state-based perspective.
So I think you don't need CARB-X in fields like immune oncology because there's so much private money there. There's a $1 billion valuation for a preclinical asset that hasn't been in mice yet, right? So the CARB-X is needed in the antibiotic space because there's so little private investment because there's no money to be made on the back end. So you would need a CARB-X type entity only under those conditions and where there wasn't private funding and yet there was a public health need for that category. And it might be limited to infectious diseases. There might be some types of orphan diseases that you could imagine you would need this for. And certainly the global tropical neglected disease market, there's a lot of product development partnerships like CARB-X that already fill that need. Your question about the CARB-X conditions, the language we have now in our subaward agreement, the conditions we have, are really carved in stone. There was a one-year-long process of normalizing these provisions with our funders as well as the companies and whatnot and other stakeholders. They're not going to change, in any way in the foreseeable future. It strikes a great balance at this point.
Hi, so there were two slightly unrelated questions. The first is
If you could just give your name, please.
Fred Ledley, Bentley University. One is with antibiotics particularly, is there a role for bulk purchase? Military stockpiles, for example, antibodies against anthrax and many other agents as a defense against biological, including disease, germ warfare, and that has those very large bulk purchases have had very significant impacts on some of the biotech companies that develop those products. The unrelated question, Kevin, is whether you comment on the fate of Cubist, which was one of the certainly stars of the biotech world, which talked about antibiotics and was not only taken out by Merck, but everyone was fired in about 2 or 3 months.
So to say about Cubist first, Cubist was a public company and had a first-in-class drug against gram-positive daptomycin, based in the Boston area. So like everything in Boston, it's a world champion, right? This is where you're supposed to moan back at me. I'm just sad that the Red Sox are having such struggles this year right now. But when they were acquired by Merck, I think a lot of people in the market were surprised by how much Merck paid for it. And then I think a lot of people were surprised too when Merck took all the R&D spend and converted it to cash by closing down all the operations. On the positive side, a lot of those people that used to work at Merck, used to work at Cubist doing antibacterial work, now are at 24 different startups in the Boston area, and some of those antibacterial. But certainly the economics in a large company are very different from the economics in a company that's focused on antibacterial work. Today, only 4% of the preclinical antibacterial projects on the planet are inside of large companies. All the rest are inside of very small enterprises or academic institutions. I'm forgetting your first question. Yeah, so bulk purchase typically drives prices down. It's a bad idea in antibiotics. If the goal is to reduce prices, don't do it because you're just squeezing the system more. But the largest funder for CARB-X is BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. Their job is to protect Americans. They have a biodefense mission. And they originally got involved in antibiotics because they realized that if there was a nuclear blast or a pandemic influenza, that people might survive the first round, but absent antibacterials, they wouldn't survive, the ongoing infection that follows. And so they've provided funding for a lot of preclinical and clinical work through us and through their own programs. And the downside is that there's only so much you can buy for the Strategic National Stockpile. They may well buy some plasmamycin for the Strategic National Stockpile, but not enough sales to have saved the company from bankruptcy because they filed back in April. So there needs to be something beyond just even the volume of pills sitting in a stockpile or in a vendor-based inventory. It needs to be something else on top of that. So I'd send you to the bill introduced in the Senate, and looking forward to other legislation as well, trying to bring delinkage or market entry rewards to antibiotics in the United States.
If I may, I will pose one more question to Doug. Doug, you mentioned that in your purchasing of pharmaceuticals, you get the Medicaid rebates, presumably. But then I think you also said you get some supplemental rebates. And I wonder if you could speak to sort of order of magnitude and how does that work? Is it for all of Medicaid? Is it just for your particular organization?
So thank you for asking that clarifying question. So New York State, and this is one of the things that I would advocate, is within government programs, it is much more powerful for a state Medicaid program to do a single negotiation with a drug manufacturer around rebates than it is to have upwards of 3 to 10 to 12 to 30 payers individually negotiating with manufacturers or through PBMs for supplemental rebates. So in terms of what New York State did, actually they negotiated with the manufacturers for state-based Medicaid rebates on all HIV medications as a way of increasing access and availability. So the plan receives a premium, pays the PBM for the drug. We file daily medication encounters. And the state is actually able then to count and negotiate and secure the rebates directly from the manufacturer. So they put the money out in the rate first, recoup the rebate, which actually net effects pays for the cost of the expanded access. In terms of the supplemental rebate, so a place where the state had negotiated HIV rebates, but with regard to our clinically approved or preferred drugs for Hep C treatment, there was no state-based rebate. And so we actually had to go out into the marketplace to negotiate those on our own. We chose to work those through our PBM, who had already negotiated with the drug manufacturer. But as I mentioned earlier, that route often requires a plan to list that drug as the preferred drug within your formulary. That was fine for us because it actually was, in fact, the preferred drug for treatment of HIV, co-infected persons with HIV. But it's a time-consuming process, and you're not really able, as an individual payer, to achieve the rebates that could be achieved when you have a Medicaid program, Medicaid director negotiating those directly. And the state actually then gets those revenues very quickly. And actually, in New York's program, we have a Medicaid redesign process where we're actually prohibited from Medicaid costs going up over a certain percentage, and there actually is a drug formulary cap, spend cap as well. So I really urge state-based Medicaid programs to negotiate those rebates directly with manufacturers, and then it's applied across the program.
Okay, and it applies, the rebate immediately feeds into the net price that you're figuring into your budget.
Well, our budget is based on the negotiated price that we pay through the PBMs. The state budget actually recoups the rebate, so the money goes to the state. It's not a net effect where the state reduces the premium. They must fully fund the cost of the access for the drug to the payer, who then pays the PBM, but with real-time encounter reporting on pharmaceuticals, the state is actually able to recoup those dollars on an expedited basis.
Yeah.
Just wondering if I could ask a question of Lee. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of activity in Capitol Hill on your issue. There's like the Trump transparency on pricing and you know the Grassley bill. I was wondering if you are able to comment on you know things that AARP thinks are the most promising or.
Promising in the sense that what we like, because I'm not sure I can prognosticate exactly what's going to happen these days. But yes, we've certainly been encouraged by what the administration has been doing. You mentioned the transparency. That's an issue or an approach that we certainly like. In terms of what's happening actually today in the Senate Finance Committee, you mentioned the Grassley bill, and that actually is something that includes a lot of different things that we like. One of which is a hard out-of-pocket cap for Medicare Part D. They're trying to redesign the benefit, and that is something that we think would be incredibly important. And CBO scores look very promising in terms of beneficiary impacts, so we were really happy to see that. And they also are looking at inflation-based rebates under Medicare Part B and Part D, which is something that we have heard talked about but haven't actually seen before, and that is something that also has gotten a lot of attention, both positive and negative. So it remains to be seen what will actually happen with that, but I think it's safe to say that this is something that policymakers have really grabbed onto. It is an issue, again, I mentioned, really resonates with a lot of different people. So I think the action is certainly going to continue, potentially even seeing something on allowing Medicare to negotiate on behalf of its beneficiaries this fall. So yeah, remains to be seen what will actually rise to the top, but we are seeing a lot of different things that we think are moving in the right direction.
Oh, sure. This one is for Lee as well, and it's just a question. We've seen this reform-type movement play out at the state level repeatedly, where you have the idea for the reform, it polls well, and then eventually you have the introduction of standard talking points about threats to innovation. And I'm curious, particularly in the context of today's topic, sort of what ARP senses among the elderly voters about this notion of what their susceptibility to certain talking points, regardless of whether or not we think to what degree they're true or not, and their willingness of a sort of trade-off in terms of access versus the perceived threat of innovation.
You raise a very excellent question. I think the reality is we would not still be hearing those message points if they weren't still working. So I think that the public still remains very susceptible to those types of threats. And it's a very personal issue. You know, nobody wants to be the person that says no, and then their relative is not treated for the condition that is affecting them, or they are not treated for the condition that's affecting them. So it can be very difficult to break through. I do think there's been a lot of work to try to educate consumers about the validity of those claims, and I do think the fact that policymakers are openly criticizing those message points is something that is a step in the right direction. But I think for the time being, yes, I do think they do still resonate, unfortunately, and that is part of the reason why they've been so effective at kind of watering down some of the proposals we've seen lately.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, seeing none and seeing coffee at the far end of the room, I think I'll call this session to a close and ask you to please join me in thanking our panel for excellent presentation.